All right, here we are in Equipment, Software, and Services Part 2. Some of you will be old enough to get that reference. Others won't. I'll move along. Buying stuff, downloading stuff, and still with no ing, install and setting up stuff. To make a podcast happen, you need stuff. We already went over some of the physical stuff. Now we have to go over the less physical stuff, the virtual stuff. You need something to capture your recording. Part of that is your microphone. The other part of it is recording software. You might need a way to bring hosts and guests together if you're not a solo caster. You need software to edit your audio after it's recorded, because don't be one of those podcasters that records and doesn't edit their audio. There are a number of reasons that's a bad idea. Don't be that person. You also need a hosting provider. And you might eventually want podcast editing services, which we'll talk about in, I think, the last slide of this module. Let's start with recording, because that's really where it all begins. If you're a solo caster, this is super easy. Check the little links below this video in the courseware, and you'll get a link to download and install a program called Audacity. Completely free. It's not going to cost you a cent. Works on Mac, works on Linux, works on PC. So you can use it no matter who you are. If you've got no guests, it's just you, your thoughts, and a microphone, then Audacity is it. So you'll open Audacity, hit record, and start talking. That's all you got to do. And when you're done talking, you'll hit stop, and your audio is recorded. This is the easiest way to podcast. Least amount of moving parts, fewest number of people, super easy. If you're not a solo caster and you're instead a podcaster with a co-host and guests who are remote from you, then you want a solution like Boomcaster, Squadcast, or Riverside. These things are online meeting solutions that are designed specifically for podcasters. In function, they would appear to be a lot like Zoom. But importantly, they are not Zoom. You should never, under any circumstance, I don't care how much your 80-year-old CEO insists, use Zoom to record podcasts. Okay, never do this. You should use a solution to record audio that is built around recording audio. That is not what Zoom is built around. Zoom is built around getting people to be in front of each other, visually and audibly, so that they can have really crappy meetings that they wish were emails instead. Right? That's really what Zoom is for. But these products, Riverside, Squadcast, Boomcaster, I'm a fan of Boomcaster. I've used all of them. They're all great. These products are designed to record high-quality audio, not Zoom-quality audio, high-quality audio. You ever been in a Zoom meeting and like people's audio sounds like shit? You know what I'm talking about. Don't subject your listeners to that kind of audio quality, okay? Riverside, Squadcast, and Boomcaster are platforms that do what are called double-enders. So what a double-ender is, you're having a conversation and the audio quality during the conversation is no better than a Zoom recording, right? Because it's over the internet. However, at the same time, a local, uncompressed, not over the internet version of the audio is being recorded at the same time. Then the conversation's over. Both sides of the conversation, or all 6 sides of the conversation, whatever it is, get uploaded to the cloud and are synced. And now you have locally recorded, clean, uncompressed, high-quality audio that you can work with and release as a podcast. That is what you want to do. I actually just said that. For meetings you wish were emails instead. Don't record your podcast with Zoom, please. Your listeners will thank you, and I will not feel bad when people say, hey, Tanner, someone who graduated your course just told me they use Zoom to record their podcast. I'll be professionally embarrassed. I'll never work in this town again. Please don't use Zoom. If you're an all-in-one place caster, but by this I mean your host is in the room with you, and your guest is in the room with you, and your co-host is in the room with you. You're all in the same place. You're the person using an audio interface device and XLR microphones. What do you use to record? You obviously don't need to use a cloud-based solution, right? Because everyone's present. You don't need something to connect people. If it's a maximum of 2 people, Audacity will work. Audacity will allow you to record 2 inputs and only 2 inputs. So if it's more than 2 inputs, Audacity will actually still work, But there's going to be an extra step since, like I just said, Audacity can't record more than 2 inputs at a time. So for this somewhat uncommon scenario, and I say it's uncommon because in the post-pandemic, or whatever we're calling the world we live in now, most people are having remote interview podcasts. It's not common for 2 people, co-host and host, host and guest, co-host, host and guest, to all get in the same room. That is not anywhere as near as common as it used to be. It used to be the default, but now not really. Now we're podcasting with people who live all over the planet. So when I say it's somewhat uncommon, I really mean it's increasingly uncommon. But if this is you, I recommend recording into your audio interface device and transferring the files to Audacity later to edit. The audio interface devices I recommended, the ones with 3 or more XLR inputs, so the PodTrack P4, the PodTrack P8, and even if you decided to go with a Rodecaster, all of these can be used as audio interface devices, but they can also stand alone as recording devices. So you could technically take any of these, unplug them from your computer, take them anywhere you want, and record onto them, onto an SD card. Then you can take the SD card out, plug it into your computer, or plug the whole thing into your computer and transfer the file. Recording to the SD card and then dragging and dropping those files into Audacity will be much more approachable for a beginner than the alternative, which would be recording into a digital audio workstation, and that's something that you will grow into. It's not something you start with. A digital audio workstation is an immensely complicated piece of software that audio engineers use to do their work. I am not about to drop you into that as a beginner. That would be a disaster probably for most of you. Editing software. You guessed it. It's Audacity. The biggest reason I don't want to throw you into a DAW for recording is because DAWs are powerful, professional, and complicated. Audacity is very much like a DAW, but its learning curve is significantly less steep. Compare, maybe a good analog is Windows Movie Maker. For those of you who are old enough to remember that, I feel like I make a lot of people who grew up in the 80s and 90s references, but Windows Movie Maker versus Adobe Premiere Pro. One of those, the prior, is just much easier to use and much easier to learn because it's simple. It doesn't have a lot of advanced, wild features that you frankly don't need unless you're a professional audio engineer who needs to know those things, like me. Whether you record into Audacity directly as a solocaster or drag and drop files into it from Riverside, for example, or drag and drop files into it from your SD card, Audacity is the software you'll be using to edit your podcast. And don't worry, there's a video this week that is going to show you the basics of how to do that, because we're going to edit your podcast trailer, which, if you can even imagine, you're actually going to make this week. Choosing a podcast hosting provider. Podcast hosting providers, or sometimes they're just referred to as hosts, although that can get confusing because the host of a podcast is also a host, are website hosting providers for podcasts, essentially. You probably know what a website hosting provider is, GoDaddy, right? You've probably heard of GoDaddy. Well, this is the same thing, but it's specifically for podcasts. Websites are small in comparison to audio files when we're talking about the weight of something in megabytes or kilobytes, however big it is. Your average website might weigh 5 megabytes, but your average 1 hour long podcast MP3 audio file at 128 kilobit per second, 44.1, this will make sense later, is going to weigh just shy of 60 megabytes. So that means that if 1,000 people come to your website, you're going to use 5 gigs of bandwidth. But if 1,000 people are downloading your podcast, just one episode of your podcast from your website hosting provider, that is 60 gigs of bandwidth. And you don't want to have that happen because you'll blow through your bandwidth allocation. Even if you're quote unquote unmetered, if you use up too much of your bandwidth, your podcast hosting, or rather your website hosting, will get shut down. So you do not want to host audio on your website. That is a recipe for disaster. And the bigger you get, the more of a recipe for disaster that is. You wind up having to do things like purchase VPS hosting. But this isn't a web hosting course, so I'll move on. So you need a podcast hosting provider. You need one. You cannot get away with not doing it. I recommend Sounder.fm. There are many options out there for podcast hosting providers. I have come to trust and enjoy Sounder FM. I enjoy them more than any other host I've used, and I have used about all of them, to include every single one I'm about to name you as an alternative option. Some others are Captivate.fm, Transistor.fm, Buzzsprout.com, Megaphone.fm, Libsyn.com, Blueberry, that is not a misspelling, there is no E in that, and there are 2 R's, Blueberry.com, and the list goes on. There are probably, at this point, I think there's at least 30 of these. And in truth, they're all pretty equal in basic feature set. They all do what they're supposed to do. But as far as extra feature sets, I've got to put at the top Sounder, Captivate, and Transistor. And I prefer Sounder. Now, I'm going to assume that you're going to choose Sounder too. This isn't me telling you have to, right? Again, there's no affiliate links here or anything. I'm telling you to choose Sounder because it's my top recommendation, and it's the one I use for all my podcasts. So if you choose another one, that's fine. Just know the fact that there are 30 possible options out there, I can't make a video for every one of those. That's not very practical. So the material you're going to see in this accelerator, the material anyway, which pertains to podcast hosting providers and uploading episodes and setting things up, it's going to be in Sounder FM. I can only teach you one. So my suggestion is that you get the same as me. And if you don't, I might be able to give you some one-on-one help in the Discord, but I can't teach 30 different students 30 different platforms. We want to all be on the same thing. And Sounder is probably one of the best priced, to be honest. And like I said, it is my favorite. They've got some killer features, which you'll see in a video this week, actually. Sounder.fm has one tier, $12.99 a month. This is pretty good. Most podcast hosting providers are at $15 or $20. So it is one of the more affordable. There are some that undercut it a bit, like $9.99, but they also don't have the same rich feature set. And you can save a little bit of money, probably turn it into $10.99 if you pay for it all at once, a year up front. All right, last slide, I think. I can't remember. Hiring an editor. There is no doubt that eventually you're going to want to outsource your editing. Your talent will probably never be editing. It will be content. You're a creator. You're not an audio engineer. When it comes time to do this, to hire an editor, there are options. Option number 1. Oh, actually, before I say option number 1, you may decide, hey, I'm a weirdo like Tanner, and in doing this podcasting, I've actually figured out that I kind of like audio engineering and I want to do that. Well, if you ever want to do that, come see me. I train podcast engineers. It's another course that I offer. And I can train you as a certified podcast engineer. But barring that, because that's going to be, 0.0001% of you, because we're weirdos. Most of you are either going to suffer through doing this yourself for as long as you can possibly stand it, and then you're going to quit podcasting because you can't do it anymore, or you're going to get to a point where, okay, I have to allocate some money to hiring an editor because this is a nightmare. It's taking up all my time. So option number 1 is you can hire an American, and by that I just mean locally, I guess. I'm in America, so I'm saying hire an American, and pay between $70 and $150 an episode. That is a fair rate. $70 is actually pretty common. So is $100. $150 is a little bit at the higher end. This is assuming you've got a podcast that's up to an hour long and has 2 people speaking, a host and a co-host, or a host and a guest. Option number 2, offshore it and pay between $30 and $70 an episode. Now, I've got a good friend of mine that runs an organization called Podcast Engineers in the Philippines, and they do great work. This might seem like you're, shorting somebody money, but $30 to $70 in the Philippines is actually a better rate than $70 to $150 in the U.S. So you're not taking advantage of anybody. It's also true in Thailand. There's some good organizations in Thailand as well. You're not taking advantage. It's about what you can afford. And the only downside of offshoring it is, of course, that you usually have to deal with some language barrier issues, and people have varying tolerances for that. I'm pretty patient about it personally. I think most people are. And then, of course, the time delay. So when I work with my buddy in the Philippines, that's it's 24 hours are gonna go by before I actually get a response to a question I sent at noon my time, right? That's just how it works. So if you're somebody who can deal with delays and doesn't need anything done right immediately, right this second, or doesn't have a problem that needs to be solved right now, then offshoring is a pretty good option. But if you hire American or local, you can expect to pay something like that. And I think that price is probably also going to hold true in Europe, given the fact that at the time of recording, the US dollar and the euro are pretty equal. When you are ready for this, please come to me for suggestions. You cannot hire me as an editor. I really don't do that anymore. I have like a couple editing clients, and I'm just trying madly to get rid of them. I just like them too much. You make friends with people if you work with them for long enough. But not only do I train podcast engineers, which I said before, based in the U.S., but I have great relationships with offshore solutions, so I can save you from making a poor decision. Please don't go to Fiverr to figure this out, okay? Remember we talked about release frequency? You know, if you're paying somebody offshore $50 to edit an episode and you're doing every other week, well, that's only $100 a month. That's pretty affordable. And same thing, if you're paying top end for an American editor, that's only $300 a month. That's still pretty affordable. Please don't go this alone. Do yourself the favor of connecting with me and letting me put you in touch with either people that I've trained here in the States or people I trust and have worked with overseas. And I will steer you in the right direction. I never take a cut of that, by the way. There's no kickback for me. I just don't want you to be in a position where you get a bad editor, because that can happen. And that is it for this module. At this point, you've got everything you need to record, edit, and publish a podcast, which you're going to get a taste for in this week's second to last. I put final here, but second to last module, because, well, you know what? You're gonna actually release your podcast trailer, and you're gonna technically launch your podcast this week if you're moving along at the same speed as I am. And again, I'm going to say this at the end of every module for this first week. You get those 3 months of extra support and lifetime access to this material. So if you need more time, don't sweat it. If you can keep up with the pace we're moving at, that's good. But hey, if you need more time, it's okay. Don't stress out. But this week, if we can do it, if you've got your equipment and you've got all your stuff figured out, then we're going to record in our next video, I think. We're going to record your podcast trailer, and we're going to publish it. We're actually going to launch your podcast. But it's a soft launch because we're not really going to promote it. I'll explain more when we get to that. Until then, thanks for watching, and take care.